It's not the same.
As Nintendo inevitably announces the next Mario platformer or the next big Zelda adventure, people can't help but weep over the large amount of franchises that Nintendo has seemingly forgotten about. Whether it be Kid Icarus, Pikmin, or that one racing series featured in Smash Bros., a lot of these franchises seem to be left behind with no sign of returning. And while yeah, obviously that sucks, people seem to overlook the fact that there's essentially an entire genre that Nintendo has abandoned, that we always took for granted. Let me take you back to the early 2000s. You had your Nintendo GameCube, and you had your Game Boy Advance. Your GameCube was for all the big budget, top of the line games. Games like Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker, and Pikmin. With their grand scale and, price, these are likely the games you were most looking forward to playing after getting home from school. Your Game Boy Advance obviously wasn't as powerful, only being optimized to run games made from pixel art. But it was cheaper and portable, so you had to play smaller games while you're stuck at school. Games like Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga, Legend of Zelda The Minish Cap, and Advance Wars. Sure, you may have loved these games, but it's likely that if you had both these consoles, your heart, time, money, and soul all belonged to the GameCube.
So what do you think?
It's very realistic. It's better than any other system that I played before.
I agree. Eventually the Nintendo DS comes out, and it was a huge upgrade over the GBA. Not only does it have 2 screens and a bad case of lipedema, but unlike the GBA, it had the ability to run full PS1-esque 3D. Yeah, the DS's 3D capabilities weren't great, so while many games utilize them, the franchises that are kind of required to look gorgeous, like the Kirby series and Yoshi's Island, still mostly went with traditional pixel art. However, eventually came the Nintendo 3DS, with graphics comparable to that of the GameCube, and the fact that the system was based around the gimmick of a 3-dimensional illusion, there was not really any need for pixel art anymore. Not to mention, Nintendo was serving it to us with a full remake of Ocarina of Time, and the promise of a new 3D Mario platformer exclusively for the system. With games like that and graphics like this, it seemed like the future of Nintendo handheld gaming was going to be better than ever. So what reason did we, or Nintendo, have to ever look back? There's been a severe drought that's been going on for many years now of games from Nintendo that are based around pixel art and sprites. Most people would think that all we're missing out on is just another graphical style. The games are the same, but hey, they look 3D now. But really what we're missing out on is much bigger than that. Pixel art has become universally iconic to the world of electronic media. How many times have you seen the original Mega Man sprite edited to be a culturally relevant character? Or how many times has Nintendo re-released the original Super Mario Bros? The answer is 7, but I'm proud to say I've only rebought it twice. One of the most popular things in the world is a 3D game where all the textures are made from pixel art. But despite all of this, pixel art seems to have the defining trait of representing old games to most people. And a large part of that comes from the fact that pixels were really all old consoles could do. That and the big games today don't use them at all. It's unfortunate that the general public, and Nintendo, seem to have this mindset when it's really so much more. It's a very distinct form of art. The expressions and style that can be put into pixel art can give off a more unique style than even if it was the same thing but hand-drawn. This is something that independent developers have certainly realized, and because of it we have an array of more recent games using the art of the past with the technology of the present, in order to look absolutely stunning. Additionally, perfecting 3D models is a much more daunting and expensive task than making a good 2D game. It's hard to recreate the bounciness or the expressiveness you can have with sprites, and trying to achieve the same level of beauty in a 3D environment where the small details often aren't in view is difficult to say the least. Yes, there are 3D games that are wildly expressive and beautiful, with a recent example being Luigi's Mansion 3, probably one of the most wonderfully animated games from Nintendo in many years. But here's the thing, not only does making something like that take a ridiculous amount of time, but it also costs money. Whether you like it or not, a game is only as good as its development time and budget allows it to be. A good example of the penalties that come with forcing 3D where it doesn't belong would be Castlevania Lament of Innocence on PS2. The franchise director, Koji Igarashi, had great success with Circle of the Moon on GBA, currently having a critic score of 91 on Metacritic. However, his next project after Circle of the Moon would be a 3D Castlevania game on PS2, and that game went on to get a Metacritic score 1 point higher than Castlevania 64. It's painfully obvious that the budget for this game was not near what it should have been for a project on this scale. And don't quote me on this, but I've heard it was around the same size as the GBA games, which is, obviously, pitifully low for a PS2 game. Yeah, I know it's not a Nintendo-developed game, but it still not only demonstrates what happens when something is given too small of a budget, but also demonstrates what happens when something well-suited to 2D is forced into a 3D environment. Nintendo seems to have forgotten that the option to make pixelated games is even there, and it's so disappointing, especially considering the fact that they not only created some of the most iconic games of this kind, but were one of the last big companies still making games like this. Playing the Game Boy Advance today, you realize how refined the art was becoming. Of course, this is to be expected as they've been doing it for 20 years at that point. You'd expect them to be better, but really better doesn't begin to describe how special these games are. It only really hit me when I recently replayed Wario Land 4. The amount of personality and detail in every single sprite is something I never really took notice of before. It's incredible how brilliantly crafted everything is down to the pixel. All the uniqueness in the bosses, the backgrounds, Wario himself, and even the most minor enemies really make me go, this game's good. We did get a Wario Land game not too long after, that being Wario Land Shake It. It was still a 2D side-scroller, but this time it used the almighty power of the Wii for a hand-drawn style. It was gorgeous, don't get me wrong, but the amount of character that Wario Land 4 exudes is simply not there with Shake It. Or at the very least, it's radically different. Whether that's the fault of the game's direction or the art style, I guess I couldn't really tell you definitively, but either way I can't help but feel that Wario's home is in pixelation. Now, if you want to see what it looks like when your dying child is brought back to life, look no further than Metroid Samus Returns. On Game Boy Advance, Metroid Fusion was another game with masterful pixel art. However, this time it's used to create a more eerie style fit to the Metroid series. The next Metroid game in the classic style was Metroid Zero Mission, which pretty much used Fusion's engine to make a full remake of the original Metroid. Then the next one took 13 years. Metroid Samus Returns came out on the 3DS in 2017, and let me tell you, if your favorite color is yellow, then this game is for you. Samus Returns is a pseudo-remake of the original Game Boy classic, Metroid 2 Return of Samus. For this remake, they abandoned 2D sprites for something that can make more use of the slider on the side of the 3DS. While the classic Metroid gameplay is still there, the game looks like a mock-up image of a new Metroid game, not a finished product. If we weren't given Fusion, I'd say it looks fine enough, but instead it simply shows how much personality is lost through a transition like this. Luckily, some developers know what's best for a game. In 2006, we got Mother 3.
God, I hope someone from Japan is watching so that statement's at least partially true.
Originally conceived as a blocky mess for the Nintendo 64, it was resurrected in the next generation only years after its original cancellation. Despite the fact that the GameCube was quite capable of creating beautiful 3D games, the series director, Shigesato Itoi, made the decision to put Mother 3 on the Game Boy Advance so it would have the same pixelated art style that Earthbound did a whole 12 years beforehand. He said this style simply felt the series best, and I have to agree, especially considering how Ness and Lucas are portrayed in Super Smash Bros. Hear me out on this. They look phenomenal, but they absolutely do not give off the same melancholy vibes that their games do, especially not with their high-pitched voices. With how Mother 3 has gone on to be one of the most beloved Nintendo games of all time, Itoi's choice to put the game on the Game Boy was definitely a smart one, and otherwise it could have looked like this. Now, the two franchises that I think have fallen the biggest victim to Nintendo's negligence are the Kirby series and the side-scrolling Mario games. Kirby is a franchise that's pretty notable for taking on art styles that are not only new and inventive, but also gorgeous. Whether it's simple pixel art, a cutesy crayon style, or something more abstract, it's rare for two Kirby games to look alike. When Kirby finally made his return to consoles after a long hiatus, it was glorious to see a Kirby game that used eye-popping 3D graphics for the first time since Kirby 64. Then the next Kirby game to be released was Triple Deluxe on 3DS, basically the same gameplay, but on a handheld. That's okay, that's fine, that makes sense, we have the technology, so bring it to a handheld, sure. The next game was Planet Robobot. Okay, that's fine, it's another Kirby game with the same gameplay, but it's another handheld title and it's got a new gimmick. That's fine. The next game is Kirby Star Allies. Okay, that would be fine if these 4 games didn't all feel the same. Not only do they basically all run on the same engine, but they simply feel way slower than the older Kirby games. Try playing Star Allies or Return to Dreamland, then play Superstar, and the difference is night and day. We did get Rainbow Curse pretty much right before Planet Robobot, and while yes, that was a 2D game with a pretty nice art style, it was a far from traditional Kirby game and was still using 3D models. It just had the illusion of stop-motion clay. As for Mario, I'm not gonna lie, I hate this game and I hate how it looks. It's lifeless, it's bland, it has the opposite of charm. It has mrotch. I loved the first game, I thought it looked great for a DS game, but seeing the same art style blown up to the big screen really shines a light on how ugly it really is. Something just looks so off and I can't stand it, and I especially can't stand that they did this for 4 whole games in a row. Now, recently a remake of the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team games was announced, and the art style attempts to recreate that of the original game's concept art. And that's great, just really great, but why are you using 3D models to recreate 2D artwork? The backgrounds look fine, but the blocky 3D models just remind you that no matter how good it can look at times, this is in fact a collection of polygons. We have the technology to practically make the concept art playable, but instead that opportunity is being squandered so it can look more modern. And again, it's just disappointing. I think a large reason as to why Nintendo seems to refuse to create new entries in their franchises using pixel art is because of how the general consumer views 2D artwork. No matter the money put into them or the quality of the game, it's hard to charge a full $60 for something that looks cheap to the average consumer. Even Super Mario Maker 2, while technically a 2D game, had its marketing centered around its inclusion of a 3D world mode, despite the fact that most of the game is centered around the earlier Mario titles. And while some 2D indie games have had ridiculous commercial success, they're usually much cheaper than a full retail release, reinforcing the stereotype that a 2D game should not be $60, something that Nintendo is not willing to lose money over. With Sonic Mania recently releasing with probably some of the best pixel art ever made, I'm left wondering what it would look like if Nintendo took the same approach to any of their franchises. And I can't help but say, Nintendo, please just give us Wario Land 7. Also, just so I don't get yelled at for not mentioning it, there were some pretty recent Nintendo games that did use pixel art, those being the Mario and Luigi remakes. And despite Nintendo deciding creativity is an outdated concept, they do look wonderful. But that's only one franchise that has stuck to its roots while pretty much every other has ditched them. And if anything, Nintendo is going to look at the sales for the Inside Story remake and go, well, I guess we're never doing that again. My point is not that 3D games look bad, but the issue is that it's being forced where it doesn't belong. It's a shame to see Nintendo ditch what essentially their entire foundation was built on. We'll likely never see another Metroid, Kirby, Wario Land, or even Mario game that uses pixel art like they originally did.
So while Nintendo doesn't currently understand the importance of pixel art, we can hope that someday they'll come back to their senses and make another game that has it front and center. But as for now, I'm gonna get back to watching this Nintendo Direct that my mom paused for me while I was at school. Yes! Yes!